Meditation. It's that time of the day where we close our eyes and we just allow ourselves to breathe. Just feeling the breath as it naturally flows, gently in and gently out of the body. That time of day where we just allow our feet to root to the earth. That time of day where we begin to feel our crown chakra opening, becoming open and becoming willing to fast from those things that no longer serve us, and to feast upon those that do. I invite you to allow yourself to just become more relaxed with each breath. As you relax, I invite you to bring to mind something that you want to fast from. Maybe it's fear. Maybe doubt. Maybe feelings of unworthiness. Anything that you feel has or continues to hold you back in life. And now is a time when we practice release, because we want to release those things that no longer serve our highest good. Because we know what's true. We know the truth that we are part of this divine essence, this God, this universal source. And within that truth, there can't be anything less than all that which is good and all of that that serves our highest truth. So I invite you now to be willing to be bold and to be courageous, to release those things, to feel them flowing up and out of your body. And I invite you to take a breath, a deep breath, as this flows out, creating space for something new and something good. Creating space for your higher truth to come forth. And as we prepare to enter into our moment of silence, I invite you to maybe say a mantra that's already your own, or maybe just silently say to yourself, I release. I release those things that no longer serve me. I release those things that do not serve my highest truth. I invite you to just gently repeat that as we move into our moment of silence. And as you now begin to bring your awareness back to this room, I now invite you to welcome those things that do meet your highest good. Things such as faith, and things such as courage. Because we know that these things are what we are. We can never be anything less in spirit. And I invite you to silently affirm, I am faith. I am courage. I am truth. And I invite you to breathe and to know. And you may open your eyes when you're ready. And we further affirm our good as we enter into our new Lord's Prayer. I kept looking in the back, hoping that Carl and Ellen were going to appear and be dancing to that. Because that would have been funny. That would have been a good dance. But anyway. So how's everybody doing this morning? On this bright, what I think is supposed to be a 51-degree day or something like that. And I'm happy to admit that this Texan did not even need a coat this morning. So anyway, hopefully everybody's going to have some time to get out and enjoy the sun this afternoon. And the heat. So I know my dogs are happy about it as well. What was that? Oh yeah, that's fine. I'll take mud over snow any day. All right. So today is our first Sunday of the observance of the season of Lent. Now I remember the first time I heard somebody in Unity mention Lent. I was like, you know what? I'm out the door. I think I'm going to run away. Because it took me back to my Baptist upbringing. I was like, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. But the reason why is because in Lent, I was taught that I had to repent for my sins. That's what we were taught in the traditional church. Well, we go into Lent because it's a time that we repent from our sins, and other traditions may look at it differently, but that's how we were taught in my church. But that, of course, took for me to first admit that I was a sinner. And that just didn't feel really good to me, considering myself a sinner. And, of course, in Unity, we don't talk much about the word sin. You're going to very seldom hear it mentioned. And when we do, it doesn't mean that we're doomed. We've done something really awful and we're doomed to, the pits of hellfire and damnation. That's not what it means in unity. It instead means that we're experiencing this false sense of separation. This false sense of separation from the divine or God or divine energy, whatever name you use for it. So back to Lent and my Baptist days, it usually meant that I had to give up something that I really loved. And as a kid, giving up things like bubble gum and stuff, that just didn't really work for me. See, Sandra understands. She knows what I'm talking about. And I remember it was probably a couple years ago, a friend of mine in the traditional church calls me. She's like, Evan, I'm so excited. I am finally going to observe Lent this year. And I was like, great. She goes, I'm giving something up. And I'm like, that's amazing. And I can tell by the tone of her voice she's wanting me to ask what she's giving up. So I'm like, well, okay, I played into it. I'm like, well, what are you giving up if you don't mind my asking? And she goes, I'm giving up wine. And I was like, well, that's great. Congrats. But then I thought, I was like, but you don't drink. You don't even drink wine. But in all seriousness, I told her, I was like, I think you got to give up something that you really, enjoy if you're going to, like if you eat chocolate every day, that kind of thing. But in all seriousness, I never really could understand why we were required to give something up, because 99% of the people I knew just went right back to whatever they were doing. Whatever they gave up, they just went right back to it afterwards. I remember one friend in Lent, he decided he's going to give up fast food, and yet the day after Lent, he's at McDonald's buying like 3 quarter-pounders or something like that. So to me, it kind of defeated the purpose a little bit. But back to when I first heard Lent mentioned at Unity, I started sweating, and I thought, oh no, not here too. I thought that I had left that behind. But the good news is that Unity approaches it differently. Here at Unity, we approach Lent as more than just simply giving something up. We instead approach it as the act of making a commitment. We make a commitment to take up the practice of finding those things in our life that no longer serve our highest good. Our Lent booklet this year states that with Lent, we form the habit of reaching for the highest point of view in our dealings, in all our dealings. Now, I mentioned this in the past Thursday e-blast, if you're on the email list of that I'll be using one of our Unity publications as we go through our season of Lent. And this is our Feasting or Fasting 2020 booklet. And I like it because it talks about fasting, which is also known as something that we consider denials here at Unity. And then it has us change whatever we fast, whatever we created our denial around, into feast, also known as an affirmation. So it's a really good booklet. You can get them from Unity. You can download them free from the Unity website. We have them in the bookstore for I think they're like $1 or something like that, but it's a good booklet. And you just might know who the author is on page 17, just saying. But anyway, I'm not trying to, give myself a free plug or anything, but. But why are denials and affirmations so important to us? Simply stated, a denial is a release, right? It's getting rid of that stuff that just flat out does not feel good, getting rid of the yuck. However, when we do, it's like anything else. It creates a space. It creates an open space. And what happens when there's an open space available? Eventually, something's going to come along that fills that space. So once we create space once we release something that doesn't serve us, we're creating space for something that does. And as a result, we want to fill that space with something that serves our highest good. So we create an affirmation. Something good so that we can use something good. I'm sorry, y'all, I've been on cold medication. I'm like, ugh. But something good so that we can draw something good into that space. So one of our first fasts that our book mentions this past week is from doubt. And what is doubt when you really think about it? Most of us probably recognize it as that feeling we get when we don't trust someone or something. We doubt when we don't trust. And what is one of the underlying reasons for doubt? Oftentimes when you really dig into it and you go to the root of the issue, you'll find that oftentimes lack of faith has a lot to do with it. Now our book mentions Bible verse Mark 9:24, and it says, I believe, help my unbelief. And that sounds very paradoxical in nature because it is. It's one of those things you're like, wait a second. I believe, help my unbelief? I don't get it. Well, if we go back to the fact that we are spirit and we are part of this God energy or divine energy source, in all actuality, we are faith. It's not something we seek outside of ourselves. It's not a feeling that we get. We are faith. It's not something that we seek. And it's like when we go back to what unity refers to as a sin, that false sense of separation. Because to doubt would be to experience a false sense of separation, right? From something that I already am, which happens to be faith. Now, Jesus once gave, if you're familiar with the Bible, you'll remember a parable Jesus gave. He once gave a very powerful talk when he talked about faith and how faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. Now, has anybody in here ever actually seen a mustard seed? They're tiny. If you haven't seen a mustard seed, even think about like a piece of quinoa. You've probably seen quinoa. They look really similar to me. But they're so small that you can barely even hold on to it. It'll slip between your fingers if you aren't extremely careful with it. Something that small can move mountains. That is incredible. And we may think about this and may be thinking, well, hey, I'd like to get me some of that. I mean, it's too bad Jesus didn't bottle this stuff up and sell it over the counter at Macy's, right? But the good news is that he kind of did. At least as far as the bottling goes, the bottling portion. We just don't need to purchase it at Macy's because it's free. We just have to be willing to go within and apply it because it's bottled within inside of each one of us. And that's it. It really is that simple. And one of the ways in which we can fast from this thing we call doubt is to first honor doubt. Realize that doubt isn't always a bad thing to have because without it, I might not have the opportunity to strengthen my faith. Right? Faith doesn't usually just strengthen on its own. There usually has to be these little challenges that come along to help us to both strengthen and to start to rely on that faith. Let doubt have its say. It's almost like when you hold a dialogue with another person. We don't often know where that other person's coming from if we aren't willing to hold dialogue with it. And to both be willing to both ask and answer some questions. So the first thing I might ask myself when I'm feeling doubt is, what is this about? Why is it that I'm feeling this doubt right now? Now, our book mentions that whatever we gain from the inquiry will likely be stronger than any blind faith. Stronger than merely telling ourselves, well, I've got to have more faith. I don't know about you, but I get tired of people telling me that sometimes. Well, you just got to have more faith. That doesn't help me to have more faith. It's instead like getting to the root of the problem as to why I'm feeling that lack of faith. Maybe we find the root is because we feel doubt to fear that it was a false sense embedded from childhood. Maybe we find we are feeling unworthy. It's changing perhaps the thought of, it's silly that I'm feeling doubt. I just need to have more faith. To, okay, yeah, now I know why I'm feeling that. Allowing us to move to the root of the problem, to address it, and to release it if need be, and to move forward. And perhaps one of the most important questions to ask is, what do I know to be true? Can we ever actually be doubt? No, because it doesn't serve our highest good. It's not part of the divine energy source or God. And that's usually the key to successfully being able to move through doubt. It's also approaching doubt with a willingness to ask those questions, those difficult questions, and to be willing to find the root cause. It's a willingness to move through doubt, knowing that faith can be often uncovered beneath it all. And once we do, we can release the burden that doubt causes, allowing us to really grab hold of that faith that we need to be able to persevere. And remember, faith isn't us always walking around with our head in the clouds and in denial that some things just don't go the way that we had planned. If we're living and breathing, that's going to happen in this human experience. Our book mentions faith is the inward power to see beyond the outward signs. The power to know that all is right when everything looks wrong. It goes back to that willingness to say, hey, so things may look a little messed up right now. I may not even understand why this is happening, but I know that I am a part of divine God essence, and in that, I know that I am going to be okay. In fact, let's just take going out of it. I know that I am okay. Now, as our book states, even the smallest inkling of courage can upstage the most significant amount of fear. At that moment, know that all things are possible. So now I want to talk about fasting on fear and feasting on courage. Now, I remember the first time I was asked to give a talk in front of a church as a guest speaker. I had just entered ministerial school, and A, I had no idea how to even put a talk together, and B, public speaking. That is actually rated as one of people's biggest fears is public speaking. But you'd think that somebody in ministerial school would probably be okay with the idea of public speaking, right? Not this guy. It terrified me. In fact, I think that's why I had put it off for so long, was the thought of public speaking. But the experience I had had with public speaking up until that point was when you stand up in front of the classroom in high school and you give a report. You're just sitting there reading it off of a piece of paper. You didn't even have to look up at people, but you're standing there in front of people. But in those times, I almost felt like I could barely even function. Palms would sweat. It just wasn't a pretty picture. So the morning rolls around when I'm to give my talk at church. And I'm not going to lie to you, I had even thought about calling my minister the night before and coming up with some excuse. I really had. I was like, I got to get out of this. I don't know if I can do it. But I also knew that as fearful as I felt at that moment, I would never get over that if I didn't just somehow dig deep and find that courage and just do it. So the morning rolls around, and I'm so nervous, I feel like I can barely function. I told Mindy, I said, I can't talk to you right now this morning. I just need to be in my own space. But I also begin to go through scenarios in my head of what would happen if I got out there and I just passed out. I was hoping I wasn't going to manifest something because I just pictured my knees buckling and me just hitting the floor. But the time arrives when I was invited up to the platform, and I'm glad my pants were a little baggy because my knees were just a quivering. They were just going. My mouth was so dry, I felt like someone had shoved cotton balls into it. I was like, I could barely talk, my mouth sticking together. And my hands were shaking like crazy. I tried to touch something, and my hands were like. But as I started going, this thing actually started to happen. I started to actually get into it. I began to find that I was on a roll and that I was actually enjoying it. I was like, I'm enjoying public speaking. What has happened to Evan? But by the time it was over, I felt like I was walking on cloud 9. And I knew in that moment that I was doing exactly what I was called upon to do. And it was through that tiny inkling of courage where I managed to upstage that fear. Now, fear is a big one, isn't it? It is a big one. It can be debilitating. And I feel that it holds far too many people back from living their true authenticity. Now, in our book, Reverend Kathy Beasley, who also graduated with me in ministerial school, hello, Reverend Kathy, but she mentions, like a paralyzing force that stands between me and my next right step forward, fear tries to take the upper hand. My humanity reminds me of the existence of fear as a feeling. And when I focus on the fear itself, sometimes that's all I can see. So what happens when we decide to look beyond that fear? Do you think we might start to see possibilities on the other side of that we might not have otherwise saw? And I almost view this as akin to being up on stage. I think about those cartoons where, it's dark and then there's just that giant spotlight. It's kind of like you hang out over there in the dark, and you won't be seen if you stay in the dark. In order to be seen on the stage, you have to be willing to step into the spotlight, right? To step into the light so that people can see you. It's in that moment where we remember truth, that moment where we decide to step out into the spotlight, where we remember truth. For instance, we can ask ourselves, am I fear, or do I only feel fear? See where there's a difference between saying I am fear or I feel fear. Because when we feel something, we can move past it, right? When it's not something that we are, we can move past it. And we know that in truth, we are not capable of being anything less than a part of God or of divine energy. We may feel it, but we're not actually it. So what happens when we decide to fast on fear? We then leave space for courage. Remember the Lion of the Wizard of Oz? We all remember that guy. He was like this pathetic looking dude. He's a lion, for God's sake. It's like he's scared and he's a lion. But he's always lived his life steeped in fear of his own shadow until he decides that he no longer wants to live in such a way. And all along the journey, he begins to face his fears. And as such, he begins to show this extraordinary courage. Now, our book tells us fear's message hails from the canon of cannot, while the call of courage heralds the presence of possibility. Courage does not take a backseat to fear. It forges a new path where fear dare not tread. So in other words, fear kind of decides it's going to go on a hike. It goes on a hike and it looks at the path and it sees two options. It sees the well-paved path, the well-paved trail, and it sees the one that's a bit overgrown and perhaps needs a little bit of bushwhacking. And it chooses the paved trail because what lies ahead on the overgrown trail might be too daunting. It might not ultimately lead fear to where it wants to go. Courage, however, takes the same hike and only sees one trail, the overgrown trail in need of bushwhacking, and that's the one it takes. Now, for me personally, I step out into courage by asking myself a couple of questions. I always ask myself, this comes from my mom, but it works. I actually ask myself, what's the worst thing that could happen? But then I follow up with, what's the best thing that could happen? Now, sure, I could take the overgrown trail and find out that it's too overgrown in places and I can't pass through, only to have to turn around and walk miles back and head back to where I started. I could take that path and find that it leads absolutely nowhere. But I may also take that path and find the most beautiful hidden waterfall. I won't know unless I try it. And so what if it ultimately turns out to not be the best trail? I learned something new along the way, right? I remember the day that the board called me to offer me the position here at this church. And Dwight's laughing because he's the one that called to leave the message, I believe. But anyway. But I was excited, but I was also just downright nervous. Neither Mindy or I had Mindy hadn't been to Madison at all. I had only been here for July when I gave my audition week. And neither one of us had ever experienced a true winter. Texas and then the Pacific Northwest. You have some, winter in Oregon and Washington, but nothing like here. But our house in Washington had this view out of the front windows of the Cascade Mountains. Okay, y'all don't make me feel bad. We do still own the house, so it's not too late. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I did not feel extreme fear from time to time. But then I went back to my questions. Okay, I started asking myself, what's the worst thing that can happen? And what is the best thing that could happen? Worst thing, we get there, we go through a winter and say, nope, big mistake. Let's move back to a warmer climate. Best thing, we get here, we meet amazing people, we have new experiences, and we just simply move into the flow of life. And I'm glad that we had courage because it's been a wonderful experience. But Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore defined faith as spiritual assurance, the power to do the seemingly impossible. Faith is a deep inner knowing that which is sought is already ours for the taking. And he quoted Hebrews 11:1 from the Bible. Now faith is assurance of things hoped for. He defined courage as a spiritual quality that enables one to remain poised and centered in God amidst great difficulties and danger. So as I mentioned before, today is our first Sunday within the season of Lent. And it's also a time in which we begin to draw closer to spring, closer to a time of rebirth. It's about seeing the life that's all around you and choosing to say yes when it beckons to you. It's about allowing yourself to begin to unfold to something new and something wonderful. It's about stepping up and saying yes to your divine inheritance. The inheritance that you are something far greater than you ever imagined. that you are capable of so much more than you ever imagined. It's about saying yes to the truth of your being. Not what you fear, but about what you are, which is courage and faith. Remember what Jesus said about having faith the size of a mustard seed. It doesn't take much. It simply takes a willingness to say yes and a willingness to dare to be more than you ever imagined, to own your faith and to own your courage. So I invite you to be willing. And today I invite you to say yes. Thank you. Namaste.